and welcome to Get Well with Cyree Johnson. Today we'll be talking about BDSM and lesbians and queer female assigned people. That's what the first line was. God damn, sorry, I don't think I was ready. I feel silly.
I ruined the vibe over here.
I think you might have. I brought some goofiness.
Hello, and welcome to Get Well with Cyree Johnson. This will be part of my Division 3. It is a talk show designed for lesbian sexual help and queer female assigned women, people sexual help. And today we're going to be talking about BDSM. One of the most controversial topics in the last 20 years of lesbian and queer sex. During the lesbian sex wars, also known as the larger feminist sex debate by apologists, the topic of BDSM was one of the conversations that was most heatedly argued. But as we know, and as I say in every episode, how you say you fuck is not always how you fuck. Many lesbians and queer assigned folks practice BDSM. We are not here to debate morality with anyone. Our sexual choices are our own. I want to keep the focus on safety and pleasure, not philosophical sex, as I like to call it, PDF sex. Although I strongly believe that there is a place for this conversation. But that place is not this episode. So let's get this rolling. So the whole lesbian sex book by Felice Newman, plug, says that BDSM involves consensual transfer of power between partners, but also cites that it can refer to an umbrella term combining bondage, dominance, submission, and sadism and masochism. The emphasis in BDSM is not necessarily on giving or receiving pain, contrary to popular belief, although pain can be a component. Things that don't involve pain that fall under the category of BDSM are sensory deprivation and withholding orgasm. And many people who practice BDSM note that there is pleasure in exploring boundaries of sexual activities with someone you trust, even if that person is yourself. So I just want to talk a little bit about taking a fantasy scene and making it a reality scene through negotiation. Does anybody want to, I don't want to say pop the cherry, it's exactly what came to my head. Anyone want to commence the conversation? Open the convo? Say show about BDSM. Sorry.
I think the first thing that you need to talk about always is consent. Personally, I think consent should be the basis for any conversation about sex between you and a potential partner, and especially when you're dealing with stuff like BDSM and different kinds of like power play themes. I think consent is non-negotiable and of the utmost importance.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said this.
And it makes it very sexy too when you have consent.
Consent is so
Like the
hot.
voice.
Yes, consent is sexy.
It's really personal, first of all, to think about bringing, my internal fantasy life, my imagination to play in my external, sexual relations with people. But I think something that I find similar between the way I explore queer sex and the way I explore BDSM is that there's always imagination involved. I'm asking my partner to create an encounter with me that creates so many different things, to create gender, to create, if it's a power play scenario, creating those sort of imaginary dynamics with a feeling of, truth behind them can be very hot, I think. But to bring a fantasy into real life means sharing so much of, the way that I, relate to sex, within my own little brain, which is scary, I think, to externalize with a partner, but at the same time can be so freeing, like you said, to explore it with somebody you trust, I think can just really deepen, for me, it deepens my relationship to finding, my own wiring beautiful, whatever I find sexy, whatever, brings me to that place, to share it with somebody else, even if it falls into the category of, of BDSM or fetish or, non-vanilla sex, then even more I want to, be able to share it and bring it out of myself and have it be honored and made as beautiful as other things. So
That was very eloquent.
That was
So what about pain? The pain associated with some forms of BDSM, such as spanking or flogging, back scratching, or blood play, alliterations, is complicated by the presence of endorphins. And I quote once again from the whole lesbian sex book. The line separating pain and pleasure can get quite thin once your endorphins kick in because they don't make the pain go away, but they make you feel good when it's happening. I think that the difference between emotional and mental pain is a very thin line sometimes, though, and should be discussed and negotiated with your partner or partners. Negotiating a rape scene, for instance. Yeah.
I think that there's this misconception that pain in BDSM has to be instantly overwhelming, which nobody likes that. You know, maybe somebody likes that. I don't want to go there, but
It's real.
a lot of people need a little bit of time. Like when you say warm up, that has a lot to do with what you were saying before about endorphins. If you are starting with lighter sensations, then as a top, then a bottom in the scene can build sort of a buffer of endorphins and get that good feeling going before you get into really intense stuff. And I think that also has to do with like a psychological place. My perception of a pain sensation is going to be different depending on what day it is, you know, what I'm going through in that day emotionally, you know, where my head is at. So it's not only a physical thing. I think it really has to engage in it, you have to be willing to consider a whole body kind of place. And when you say breathing, you know, all these little things that are sort of, you know, here's what we do along the way to keep things safe physically, those things I think can be incorporated in a really hot way, too, that doesn't break the flavor of the scene that's going on. You know, there's a big difference between, I'm curious about whether you're taking a breath or not, and breathe now. Like, so I think there's a way to, you know, whatever it needs to be, whatever, you know, somebody in the scene needs to sort of work in as far as safety can be worked in a really hot and consensual ways.
Speaking of safety again, don't whip bones or joints. That's just important as a general rule. Use panic snaps. And this is going to be the one time I'm going to say, spend a little money on the things that you're playing with because there's often a difference in quality as you go up in price range. Never leave someone who's tied up alone or otherwise bound, and be as attentive as you, be attentive to how you feel and as honest as possible with your partner or partners.
When you agree to top someone and you're negotiating a scene sexually, it is like when you're in those roles, it's like top and bottom. As the top, you are agreeing to take full responsibility for a lot of like the physical health of your bottom, and therefore it's paramount to check in and to have negotiated safe words ahead of time, to have negotiated what sorts of activities you want to do, and even like, you know, knowing your partner is really important because you can gauge like, oh, I'm going to improvise right now and like pull out this bullwhip, which is, you know, maybe not something you would want to do without negotiating first. I'm just going to say. So I think that like having different ways to check in, again, doesn't have to be unsexy and doesn't have to like break the flow of your scene. There are plenty of sexy, toppy ways to check in with your bottom and like make sure that you are there together at the same time and that your bottom hasn't like gone into some other scary headspace or like, you know, emotionally checked out. I think that those are really important things to keep tabs on. So in terms of safety, like I think emotional safety cannot, the importance of that cannot be underestimated or dismissed at all.
It's really important to remember that consent is one thing, but that like giving someone consent is not giving them general consent, and that giving someone consent one day doesn't mean that you'd give consent for the same things like a week later or an hour later or 5 minutes later, and that consent is revocable at any time. And then the other thing that I've just been thinking a lot about is that like these are things that for a lot of people, like even if you want it, you're like, oh, I'm nervous, oh, I don't know if I can actually do this, I think about it, but I don't know. And sometimes like when you're drunk or when you're really wasted is like the time that you feel most comfortable asking someone for something that you want or trying to negotiate something with someone, especially like with someone new, but that's not always the best time to go about it. And that like you can start, I think like that it's really important to remember that like while you're under the influence of anything, you can start discussing something, but to really pay attention to like what you're going to do physically and really what you're going to do emotionally with someone else, like that's something that you'd still feel comfortable with at a later date, and that if you do something that is uncomfortable for you later, that it's okay to talk about that was uncomfortable for you, and like why that was uncomfortable for you.
I feel like there are different ways that you need to check in with somebody that you haven't been with before, and then a long-term partner. And I think in both instances there are a lot of commonalities. Like I think it's really important to talk about like what kinds of buttons are pushable and what kinds of buttons are not pushable. What kinds of things are triggers that this person knows about, and then to be able to check in about that as things are happening, because there are a lot of things that can really surprise you. So I think that it's really important to talk a little bit about that, and also to like, as you're getting to know somebody, to get to know what they look like when they're experiencing different kinds of reactions to what's going on. And like, you know, even just like talking about like what kind of language you can use with somebody, what they think is the sexiest, because I think that like in a position of being a top, I mean, you want to top somebody in the way that they want to be topped, but it's also really sexy if you can bring in that surprise, you know, and like, so know where they want their buttons to push, you know, like know what spaces they're excited to explore, because sometimes it is fun to go a little bit beyond.
So we're going to talk about the line between S&M and abuse. To me, this is like largely a line of consent. Abuse is non-consensual by definition. You can't negotiate abuse. Consent is essential to any sort of exchange. Verbal consent without coercion, and I think like that without coercion part is very important, because coercion can be